We have got to share this with the rest of the cake. Switch it over. Okay.
Frank. Frank, yes.
Elliott Gould is one of those actors who people absolutely recognize the face, the voice, and the vibe, even if they don't always clock just how central he was to a very specific moment in American film history. For a lot of viewers, he's a familiar supporting presence. But rewind to the late 1960s and early 1970s, and Gould wasn't just a character actor. For a brief but intense stretch, he was right at the center of the New York Hollywood movement, embodying a completely new kind of leading man. Not the square-jawed hero, not the suave romantic lead, but something much more neurotic, conversational, and emotionally exposed. He came up through New York theater in the early 1960s, building that loose, rumpled everyman persona on stage before transitioning into film and television. The real breakthrough comes with Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice in 1969, a counterculture sex comedy that perfectly captured the anxieties and contradictions of the era. Gould's performance as Ted, the insecure, flustered husband trying to keep up the shifting sexual and social norms, earned him an Oscar nomination and suddenly put him on the map. Almost overnight, he became the face of a new kind of male screen presence. That persona found its perfect home in his collaborations with Robert Altman, which effectively defined his peak period. The director cast him in MASH in 1970 as Trapper John, the wisecracking, morally flexible surgeon who helped turn the film into a massive cultural event. The success of MASH made Gould a genuine star, but more importantly, it locked him into Altman's loose, overlapping dialogue, improvisational style. What followed was one of the most concentrated creative runs of the new Hollywood era. At his peak, Gould was making an astonishing number of films in rapid succession. Comedy, crime, character studies, ensemble pieces. For a moment, he felt like one of the defining faces of the era, right alongside Dustin Hoffman, Jack Nicholson, and Warren Beatty. But unlike those peers, his stardom didn't stabilize. By the mid to late 1970s, a run of commercial disappointments and mismatched projects cooled his box office heat. Films like Whiffs and I Will For Now failed to connect with audiences, and Gould became associated, unfairly mind you, with financial underperformance. As New Hollywood gave way to the blockbuster era, the kind of loose improvisational leading man Gould specialized in started to feel out of step with what studios were looking for. He transitioned into a more eclectic, sometimes erratic mix of projects. Big ensemble war films like A Bridge Too Far, odd Disney ventures, television work, and lower-profile features kept him busy, but the sense of him as a central star faded. By the 1990s and 2000s, Gould had settled into what would become his second, very successful career phase, the highly reliable, scene-stealing supporting player. He popped up in prestige films like Bugsy and American History X, indie comedies like Kicking and Screaming, and eventually found a new generation of fans through the Ocean's trilogy, where his Ruben Tishkov blended nostalgia with self-aware charm. Part of what made Gould great to begin with was that he was always more comfortable being interesting than being iconic. And that's exactly why his filmography is such a goldmine for this kind of list. Buried among the well-known titles, there are a lot of fascinating, offbeat, and underappreciated performances that show just how influential, flexible, and quietly essential he's been to modern American screen acting. So, to give them the attention they deserve, here are my top 5 picks for Elliott Gould's most underrated movies, listed in chronological order. But before we get started, here are a few honorable mentions. Move, a sleeper comedy from Gould's overexposure era, built around his OCD-fueled, neurotic lead as a dog-walking porn novelist. It perfectly captures 1970s Manhattan absurdity with great chemistry between Gould and Paula Prentice. Who, a Cold War sci-fi oddity where Gould shines as a cynical U.S. scientist interrogating an amnesiac astronaut who may or may not be a Soviet cyborg. It's a low-budget and strange film, but the lead's sardonic performance gives it real personality. Bustling, a gritty 1970s cop jam with Gould and Alan Garfield as believable LAPD vice detectives battling porn rackets. Raw, violent, and an unsung entry in the gritty buddy cop lineage. And finally, one to avoid. Not necessarily terrible, but it's hard to find much to recommend in Spies, a MASH reunion featuring Gould and Donald Sutherland that's uneven and rarely funny. And moving on to the ranking at number 5, we have Getting Straight. This 1970 release rides the post-Easy Rider countercultural wave as a raw campus chaos comedy drama, with Elliott Gould as an ex-activist grad student Harry Bailey, torn between settling out for a teaching credential and the radical unrest exploding around him. Vietnam vet Harry navigates master's exams, a feisty girlfriend, played by Candice Bergen, deep in protests, draft-dodging pals, and faculty clashes amid riotous student demonstrations that test his jaded ideals on a powder keg college campus. Part of the youth revolt cycle seen at the time, it captures the late 60s campus fury with chaotic, almost documentary energy, mixing tear gas, National Guard presence, and student demands into something that feels messy, urgent, and ultimately alive. What also makes Getting Straight especially interesting is how openly conflicted it is about its own politics. It doesn't present protest culture as purely heroic or purely foolish. Instead, it sits in the uncomfortable middle ground, capturing burnout, infighting, and the emotional cost of staying angry. That ambiguity gives the film a surprising modern edge. Richard Rush's direction blends agitprop riot imagery with relationship farce, creating a time capsule of Vietnam-era anxiety that's uneven but culturally vital. More valuable today as a snapshot of mood and mindset than as a perfectly shaped narrative. Gould channels peak New Hollywood neurosis as Harry, twitchy, sarcastic, burned out, and emotionally exposed. He plays Harry as a man constantly talking himself in circles, using humor and ranting as shields against disillusionment. His verbal sparring, especially with Bergen and authority figures, turns Harry into the film's chaotic, emotional core. Even when the script veers into periodic rhetoric, Gould makes it feel lived in, anchoring the ideological chaos with wounded, restless humanity. Ultimately, what makes Getting Straight especially revealing in Gould's career is how clearly it captures him in transition. He's no longer just the jilted husband of Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, but not yet the fully crystallized Altman anti-hero either. The film catches him in that in-between moment where he's testing how much political exhaustion and raw edge he can carry as a leading man. And from the social revolution in the campuses to the seedy streets of 1970s Hollywood, we get to the next title on the list, The Long Goodbye. An Altman-Gould collaboration that isn't necessarily underrated, but rather forgotten. In this 1971 title, we follow Private Eye Philip Marlowe, who gets pulled into a tangled web of missing persons, mob threats, and shifting loyalties after helping a friend in trouble. As he navigates Malibu mansions, shady clinics, and Hollywood decay, the case becomes less about solving a mystery and more about surviving a morally exhausted world. Altman transforms Chandler's hard-boiled universe into a sunlit, ironic satire of 1970s LA. The loose, overlapping dialogue and drifting camera style turns the detective genre inside out, replacing noir romanticism with laid-back cynicism and cultural hangover. It's peak New Hollywood deconstruction, a detective story where atmosphere, mood, and moral drift matter more than tidy resolutions. The film blends comedy, melancholy, and mystery in layers that make it endlessly rewatchable. Gould's Marlowe is a radical departure from the Bogart archetype. His rumpled, pajama-clad, mumbling his way through chaos with a hangdog loyalty that feels both absurd and deeply sincere. Rather than playing Marlowe as a cool knight, Gould makes him a baffled survivor of a world that's moved on without him. His offhand delivery and conversational timing and weary good faith turn Marlowe into a uniquely 1970s anti-hero. He anchors Altman's tonal tightrope, funny, frayed, and quietly tragic, proving why the actor was such a perfect vessel for New Hollywood's slacker, disenchanted sensibility. In hindsight, Gould's Marlowe feels like a blueprint for a whole wave of later anti-detectives. Emotionally available, slightly ridiculous, and fundamentally out of step with the worlds they're meant to master. It's a performance that only really makes sense in the early 1970s, but its influence stretches much further into modern neo-noir's fascination with broken, self-aware protagonists. And continuing the prolific and successful collaborations between Robert Altman and Elliott Gould, the third title on this list finds the duo back together with the 1974 critical hit California Split. The actor plays Charlie Waters, a freewheeling professional gambler crashing with prostitutes who bonds with straight-laced writer Bill Denny, played by George Segal. After a shared bad beat, what begins as a casual friendship quickly spirals into a blur of winning streaks, crushing losses, all-night benders, and road trips from Los Angeles to Reno, all in pursuit of the ultimate score. Altman's overlapping dialogue and documentary-style camera work captured the manic rhythm of gambling culture with startling authenticity. The film feels less like a traditional narrative and more like you've been dropped into the middle of a real addiction spiral where exhilaration, desperation, and self-delusion bleed into each other. It's often cited as one of the most honest gambling movies ever made, sitting comfortably alongside The Gambler and Rounders as a genre benchmark. The chemistry between Gould and Seagal is a huge part of why the movie works. They form a perfect yin-yang pairing. Gould's jittery, impulsive chaos against Seagal's more cautious, anxious energy. Their dynamic turns the film into a kind of hangout movie with a dark undercurrent where the jokes, digressions, and rambling conversations feel completely alive. In terms of Gould's career, California Split feels like one of the most purest expressions of his new Hollywood persona. This is the actor at full throttle, loose, improvisational, funny, and deeply sad all at once. It captures him at a moment where his slacker anti-hero style still felt fresh and culturally central before that kind of character began to fall out of favor later in the decade. As Charlie, the actor is electric chaos incarnate. He's a motor-mouthed philosopher quoting TV jingles and half-remembered slogans mid-poker bluff, using humor and non-stop chatter as both weapon and shield. His twitchy physicality and manic optimism sell the seductive insanity of addiction without ever glamorizing it. He also anchors Altman's freeform style. Riffing effortlessly with Seagal, Gould becomes the film's manic heartbeat, radiating infectious energy, whilst quietly signaling how unsustainable Charlie's lifestyle really is. It's one of those performances that feels both wildly entertaining in the moment and quietly devastating in retrospect. Much of the character's dialogue was improvised, which only reinforces why Gould was so central to this era. Few actors embodied the loose, conversational, emotionally exposed style of New Hollywood as completely as he does here. The next title finds the actor entering his post-overexposure phase with an independently financed commercial hit that tapped directly into post-Watergate paranoia. At number 2 we have Capricorn One. Capricorn One is a tense conspiracy thriller where journalist Robert Caulfield, played by Gould, uncovers anomalies in NASA's first manned Mars mission, racing against government secrecy and deadly interference. As NASA's Capricorn One prepares for launch, a sudden crisis sends the mission into murky territory, forcing the investigative reporter to chase vanishing evidence, compromised systems, and shadowy obstruction, even as the pressure and personal danger steadily escalate. Like 1974's The Parallax View, it taps deep into Watergate-era paranoia, faceless institutions manipulating reality to protect power. It swaps political assassinations for space-age spectacle, creating a uniquely pulpy blend of ethical dread and large-scale suspense. Peter Hyams' slick direction delivers standout set pieces and tactile, pre-CGI thrills, blending All the President's Man-style investigative tension with airport-era disaster mechanics to create a crowd-pleasing yet deeply cynical 1970s cinematic artifact. Gould's rumpled intensity grounds the conspiracy. His dogged, sweat-soaked reporter pestering officials and chasing leads through mounting danger turns institutional paranoia into something personal and nervy. Where similar roles often lean, cool and detached, the actor brings frantic urgency and exhaustion. The endless cigarettes, stressful calls, and barely contained frustration humanize the lone truth seeker trope, making Caulfield's isolation and obsession feel viscerally real. Compared to his Altman work, where chaos and drift are baked into the style, Capricorn One places Gould's nervous energy inside a rigid thriller framework. The contrast is striking. His familiar nervousness and verbal overflow now push against institutional walls instead of floating freely, making his paranoia feel more claustrophobic and more desperate. It's the same Gould persona, but trapped inside a system that no longer bends around him. And topping the list is a criminally underrated Canadian thriller that proves that even in a so-called downturn, actor Elliott Gould was still delivering some of his sharpest work. This is 1978's Silent Partner. This tightly wound heist thriller follows Miles Cullen, a bored Toronto bank teller who receives an anonymous note warning that his branch is about to be robbed. He quickly realizes the culprit may be closer than anyone suspects, but instead of alerting the authorities, Miles makes a quiet, risky decision that pulls him into a dangerous psychological game. What begins as a seemingly clever, opportunistic move quickly spirals into a high-stakes duel, as Miles finds himself locked in a tense battle of wits with the increasingly unstable criminal, played with gleeful menace by Christopher Plummer. As pressure mounts at work and in his personal life, the film turns into a nerve-shredding cat-and-mouse thriller, with every decision pushing Miles deeper into danger. It's one of the smartest and tightest crime thrillers of the 1970s. Curtis Hanson's script keeps the tension ratcheting upward, with twists that feel clever rather than gimmicky. The dynamic between Gould's quiet schemer and Plummer's sadistic antagonist is uniquely charged. It plays less like a standard cops and robbers story and more like a psychological chess match, with the Toronto Mall at Christmas setting giving the film a distinctive, slightly surreal atmosphere. For film history fans, it's also an early Carol co-production and features a young John Candy in a supporting role, which makes it especially rewarding in retrospect. Gould plays Miles as a seemingly timid, slightly schlubby everyman whose intelligence and nerve only gradually come into focus. His low-key deadpan reactions make the moments where he outmaneuvers his opponent feel genuinely surprising and deeply satisfying. He's excellent at charting Miles' evolution from anxious opportunist to someone capable of real ruthlessness, all whilst retaining a core of vulnerability that keeps you invested, even as his choices grow darker. The chemistry with Christopher Plummer is crucial, as I mentioned. Gould's underplayed nervous energy is the perfect foil to Plummer's flamboyantly vicious performance, so every interaction crackles with tension, dark humor, and the sense that either man could lose control at any time. Simply a must-see. And there you have it, 5 movies that should send you back into Elliott Gould's strange, essential corner of New Hollywood, where being interesting mattered more than being iconic.